The virtual curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. The virtual curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is your host, Paul Wirkus. We're talking about all things measles this month with a wrecking crew from the Division of Infectious Diseases from the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Utah. T.W. Jones, Mary Fortini, and Andy Pavia. Welcome back, all of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Good. Now, T.W., you're taking the lead this week, right?
That's right.
Introduce you just a little bit. So are you from Arizona originally? A lot of your training happened in Arizona.
Yeah, that's right. I was born and raised in Mesa, in the Phoenix area. Went to college at University of Arizona, and then went up north to Minnesota for medical school at Mayo Medical School, and then came back to University of Arizona for my pediatrics residency before finally landing in Utah for my pediatric infectious disease fellowship.
But you have one other qualification that you got while you were in Arizona.
Yeah,
You're an actual
Go ahead.
journalist.
I earned a master's degree in journalism at the Walter Cronkite School at Arizona State University.
There's so many things that are cool about that. Among other things, that the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism is at ASU.
Yeah, it was really fun. I got to work with some absolutely awesome professors who were former editors of national newspapers. I got to work with the editor for the Woodward and Bernstein story on the Nixon Watergate scandal. I got to work with former editors from Sacramento Bee and got to do these projects that were, really fun and interesting and informative to do.
That's amazing. So do you continue to journalize?
Right now, most of my work is more related to medical education and just, working on articles for physicians. But, I have my hopes for getting some long form and book length journalism done in the future.
Oh, that's great, because last week I cited my other favorite double threat in pediatrics and journalism, Perry Klass, who professes both at NYU. So there's a whole lot of good stuff you can do writing well about stuff that matters.
Yeah, I think writing well is probably one of the most important skills that anybody can cultivate for a career in medicine or just life in general.
Well, let's dive in. Before we go farther, have you acquired any disclosures since last week?
I do not have any financial or other disclosures.
Mary, anything you've acquired in the meantime?
I have not, no.
Nobody has reached out to me with a bag of meme coin or anything else in the last week.
Measles coin? Yeah, that would be a bad thing. Let's dive right in. I want to talk about the measles vaccine, because Mary and I talked last week about the fact that the United States was measles-free for a while. The Americas were measles-free, and we're not anymore. This isn't a coincidence. We've been measles-free because of the vaccine. A little bit about the vaccine. How old is the vaccine? What kind of vaccine is it? And how does it work, TW?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is a live virus vaccine, meaning that we're taking a weakened form of the virus and giving it to a person, letting it replicate a little bit inside of them, and then their immune system picks up on it, shuts it down, learns from it, and then gives them lifelong immunity from it. The concept's really old. We've had live virus immunizations since before the American Revolution. We've had live virus immunizations going all the way back to the early modern period in China. So when I talk about live virus immunizations to people, I try to emphasize that it should be in the same category in your head as like the invention of indoor plumbing. This is an old technology. This is a technology that has made our lives better. It was introduced to the Americas with the smallpox inoculation back in 1720 by Zabdiel Boylston in Boston. It was used by General Washington to immunize troops. And then what we've done in the 20th century is made it safer, extended the concept to other viruses, and brought a lot of benefits to the population, both in terms of reducing mortality, but also preventing terrible outcomes from diseases. And measles is just one more in this long record of victories over these infectious diseases, the measles vaccine. It was developed in the 1960s. There was an early killed version that was used, and then the more modern version that we use nowadays was introduced more broadly in the 1970s. Nowadays, we have two of these that are broadly used in the public. They are MMR combination vaccines, measles, mumps, and rubella. And the two that are the commercial names are MMR Roman numeral 2 and Priorix. And then there's a third one that's a combination of the MMR and varicella, the MMRV. That's the ProQuad immunization. All of these are live attenuated vaccines.
And the MMRV is not typically used for first doses, right?
That's correct. Usually for first dose, it's going to be just MMR alone.
What's the reason for that?
So all of the MMR vaccines have a small chance of febrile seizure, but it was found with the MMRV vaccine that the chance of febrile seizure went up compared to the others. So typically that's reserved for a later age group because the risk seems higher when they're younger.
When did the measles vaccine become bundled with mumps and rubella? And is that a marriage of convenience? They're similar vaccines, or how did they end up bundled together?
I would have to defer to Andy on that one.
So in the late 60s, as both vaccines all three were being sort of perfected, the last one to really be developed effectively was the inactivated mumps strain. Because they're all live viruses, have relatively similar side effect profile, they were combined for convenience, and it was compared to giving the vaccines as single vaccines, and there's really no significant or no major increase in the side effects.
You hear objections sometimes, and we'll address this in more detail in a minute, but they seem to be compatible and work well together.
Yeah, every study on these vaccine safety has indicated that there's really no danger in receiving these three or the fourth when you're older bundled together in this way.
How effective are they?
So when you receive just one MMR vaccine, the protection is estimated to be around 93 to 94%. And then with the second dose, typically it brings you up to at least 97%. There's a range associated with those two. The range goes all the way up to 100%. So that just kind of depends on the study and the population you're looking at, but very highly protective against measles, natural measles infection.
It's probably worth pointing out that the others are not nearly that perfect. That mumps immunity fades.
The other thing, mumps and rubella.
Yeah, mumps immunity fades over 10 to 20 years after your vaccine. And so you are susceptible to mumps again, often in your 20s and 30s. We've seen outbreaks in the past in that age group. Rubella is somewhere between the two. I don't know the exact figure, but it also has some loss of immunity. And that's why some women, when they're getting tested during their first pregnancy, even though they were vaccinated, they don't have antibody and they get another dose. Well, they can't get a dose if they're pregnant, but ideally they get tested before they become pregnant.
So TW, what side effects should we expect? What are the common side effects of getting the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine?
One of your most common side effects is fever. That's found to happen in about 5 to 15% of people who are receiving it. And generally speaking, that's going to happen about 5 to 12 days after getting it. It's a mild fever typically. It passes on its own in a couple of days. A little more rarely, it could go out as long as 5 days. That rate of fever goes up, as we were saying, if you're using the MMRV vaccine. It can be up to 22% of people. Another side effect to be aware of is a transient rash. This can happen in about 5% of people. It's not anything to be alarmed about. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are uniquely contagious or anything like that with a strange measles infection. No, this just means that their body is responding as expected to the viral replication of the weakened virus that was given in the vaccine for them. As we mentioned,
the tricky thing about that for me as a pediatrician is that it typically comes like a week and a half after the vaccine, so you sort of forget why they're having a rash. But I do tell people, and tell me if this is nonsense, I tell people, well, good, it looks like your immune system saw it and recognized it and knows what to look for.
That's right. I think that's a good thing to mention is that if they are having a side effect from the vaccine, like a fever, like a rash, that actually, if anything, indicates their immune system's doing what it should do with that stimulus. So I think it's actually reassuring that they're actually responding to it. A little more rare side effects to be aware of is we mentioned febrile seizure. It can be 1 in 3,000 or 1 in 4,000 people or so. And if you're using the MMRV, that rate goes up to 1 in 1,100 or 1 in 1,400. And then a little more rare than that is a transient thrombocytopenia or low platelet count. That's in about a 1 in 22 or 1 in 40,000 chance of happening. So pretty rare, but something to be aware of if you're a pediatrician.
How low and for how long?
The reporting, when you're looking at the adverse event literature, is anything under 150,000. So it's hard to, but I'm not aware of serious bleeding complications due to the
Okay.
transient thrombocytopenia in anybody. There's one other one worth mentioning, particularly for adults who are getting their catch-up vaccination, and that is the rubella component can cause some joint discomfort. And so joint aches are, again, 1 in a couple of thousand, but something you should warn people about that can occur. Again, that's 7 to 14 days out.
And that's transient.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Yes, sir. Serious side effects.
A serious side effect to be aware of is anaphylaxis. So this would be a real contraindication to receiving the vaccine. So this can happen with almost any vaccine out there. Basically, we're looking for anybody who had some kind of real concerning allergic reaction or concerning anaphylactic reaction to their first dose. That'd be a contraindication to somebody getting a second dose. And certainly we're looking for hives that occur shortly after administration of the vaccine, wheezing, nausea, vomiting, loss of consciousness, all of the things you would normally be looking for in an anaphylactic reaction.
What about the long-term safety data? Should we worry about things that you may see down the road?
Typically, there's no long-term effects or adverse effects that we'd be concerned about. We'll talk a little bit more about the literature and the myths about things like autism or autoimmune disease. But generally speaking, there's been no long-term safety data that indicates there's a real risk of any of these long-term adverse effects.
Let's just touch on 2 points quickly, and then let's dive all the way into that. So you mentioned that 2 doses gives an average of 97% immunity, and which I think points to the reason why herd immunity matters. It's protecting the 3% who may not have gotten good conversion with the vaccine, right?
That's right. So not everybody's going to have a perfect response to the vaccine. There will be some people who just don't generate that immune response, and so they're going to be susceptible to natural infection. A very small number, but certainly they're out there. Then there are people who cannot receive the vaccine, people who are immunocompromised. We don't want to inject them with a weakened live virus. They could actually suffer adverse effects from it, so they can't receive the vaccine. Young infants who are too young to receive the vaccine, pregnant women who are unable to receive the vaccine, and then, of course, anybody else who did not receive the vaccine for religious beliefs or otherwise, they're at risk. If the majority of people are immunized, however, they provide herd immunity. They provide a sort of defensive shield around those vulnerable individuals. For measles, that needs to be about a 95% vaccination rate. So that's pretty high. A way to think about herd immunity is if you have a tree in a forest and that tree is very dry and susceptible to catching fire, if the whole forest around it is nice and damp and wet and protected against fire, that one dry tree is not going to light on fire, typically speaking. If instead the forest has lots of dry trees that are all susceptible to fire and there's very few damp trees to protect them, then you could certainly have a forest fire actually light up if there's one spark from a wayward campfire or something like that. So that's kind of one comparison I use. You have to think about it in terms of the statistical average across a population. And in measles, for how contagious it is, we need to have an immunization rate of about 95% of individuals getting the vaccine. We're lower than that in a lot of states and a lot of areas, which means that we are at high risk of measles outbreaks all across the United States.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So why don't we typically give the measles vaccine until a year of age?
Yeah, the best way to think about this is, remember, this is a live virus vaccine. It works by actually creating some viral replication inside the person who gets it, and then their immune system reacts to the viral replication, and that's what induces the lifelong immunity. A baby, remember, gets antibodies from their mother, and those often take months for those to completely wash out of the young infant as they're growing older and older. If they have the mom's antibodies circulating in their blood, and then they get the vaccine, those circulating antibodies will stop the virus from replicating, and then they won't get the immunogenic response. They can't react to a replicating virus the way they ought to get that lifelong immunity. So that's why we wait on the young infants until we think that those maternal antibodies have had some time to wash out of their serum, and then they can get a little bit of viral replication and get lifelong immunity. And that's why we wait until that 12 to 15 month range for the first dose.
Very helpful. Okay, TW, I just want you to know I've been doing my own research here, and so I want to ask you some questions about some concerns I may have about vaccines. You ready?
Yeah, fire away. Let's do it.
Brace yourself. Do measles cause autism?
No.
I'm sorry.
This
the MMR cause autism.
No on both counts, but you brought up a hypothesis that was brought up before. So this originally came from a physician in England named Andrew Wakefield. He originally worked on models of inflammatory bowel disease. Initially, his earlier work was actually all about how measles infection could cause Crohn's disease, and then he modified his hypothesis to saying measles vaccination. In 1998, he did a study where he took 12 children who had behavioral and GI symptoms, and he actually proposed an entirely new syndrome, which he called autistic enterocolitis. And he said that it seems like there's an association with the MMR vaccine or measles infection. In the paper, he didn't actually state there was a causal relationship. But then he started to hold press conferences shortly after that where he said, oh, there is a causal relationship and the MMR vaccine should be suspended. What a lot of people don't talk about was right around that time was that he actually was starting a company where they were planning on creating alternative versions of vaccines and diagnostic test kits for this autistic enterocolitis. And from documents that his company created, he stood to make about $43 million from his plan to discredit the mainstream MMR vaccine and to replace it with his own enterprise. So he was going to become quite rich if his plan was going to be successful, and that doesn't really get talked about very much. He's done quite well anyways for himself from all of this fundraising and from his own products and books and movies that he's put out there. But fundamentally, it was coming from manipulating the stories of these 12 patients to suit his ends. And that was also something that came out about the study later was that, frankly, data was manipulated and it was not really truly scientifically showing any association with these autistic symptoms or these GI symptoms. The paper was retracted. He lost his ability to practice medicine in England, and he does not have a license to practice medicine in the United States.
That study was published in a pretty good journal, right? It was Lancet, right?
That's correct. Yep. It was published in the Lancet originally. They've retracted it.
As have, I think, all of his available co-authors, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, that's correct.
But this is a story with legs. I mean, this is a story that I think still haunts people, despite the fact that it has been both methodologically as well as scientifically debunked. But it lives on.
It's worth noting, Paul, this is probably one of the best studied hypotheses in medicine. There are to date 22 epidemiologic studies, some of them of enormous size, particularly this study from Scandinavia, that have used a variety of different techniques to see if there was any association whatsoever. And 22 out of 22 showed no association. So this is about as close to disproven, myth-busted as you can get in science.
Yeah, I heard someone say once that of all the potential causes of autism, this is the one that has been most thoroughly debunked. And yet people worry. All right, next bit of research. Getting too many vaccines can overload the immune system.
Yeah, that's a great question. I understand the concern where parents are coming from, but the thing you have to understand is that any virus, any infection, and then any kind of exposure to natural things in the natural world are going to come with proteins we call antigens that get introduced into a child's system. So even just having something like a simple cold virus could introduce 10 new antigens into a young baby or toddler system. When they have strep throat, it could be up to 25, 50 different antigens. If they're outside playing in the dirt, which kids should be doing and having fun outdoors, there's tons more antigens that they're getting introduced to. When you take an average childhood vaccine, it might be between 1 to 69 antigens in those vaccines. So really, truly speaking, a child who's doing all the things we expect children to do, like playing outside, making mud pies, going to preschool, catching colds and playing with their friends, they're getting exposed to hundreds more antigens than the vaccines that we give them are really providing them. So really, the routine immunization schedule is not introducing them to too many infections or too many antigens. If anything, it's not even anywhere near what they should be getting or what they will be getting naturally.
Well, I think we underestimate the power of our immune system to deal with a lot of stuff.
That's right. It's an incredibly complicated computer in a way of thinking. I think the immune system is something potentially as complicated or sometimes even more complicated than the central nervous system. It's very smart. It can do a lot of things. When it goes wrong, it goes very interestingly wrong. But what it can do to protect us against all these different pathogens and potential pathogens of the world is really impressive. And it deserves a lot more credit than we seem to give it.
Let me have a comment on a couple of harmful ingredients. What about thimerosal?
Yeah, so thimerosal is a mercury-based preservative that used to be used in childhood vaccines. And that's really the key thing to take away here. It used to be used. It has not been used since at least 2001. And for MMR vaccine, it was never used. So thimerosal is not used at all in the MMR vaccine. After 2001, it was taken out. There was never any association shown with that and central nervous system side effects or anything like that. But just out of an abundance of caution, it was decided that it was better if it just wasn't part of the preservatives that are used for vaccines, but it's not there anymore. So if that's a concern that a family has, I think that's something that can be reassured for them, is that there's no thimerosal in any vaccine that they're going to receive.
Except maybe multi-dose flu.
Sorry, yes. So the multi-dose flu. Yep, that is one word is still used.
There's another thing
I'm
that's
sorry.
sometimes helpful to explain to parents. There's been no association between thimerosal and adverse events, but the concern is about mercury, because one form of mercury, and that is methylmercury, is quite toxic to the nervous system. And that's what caused toxicity in Miyamoto, Japan, from industrial exposure. There was never methylmercury in thimerosal. So the whole hypothesis was based on a misconception about what was in there, because it's an ethyl mercury that was used in thimerosal.
And if I remember correctly, it was analogous concern, right? In trying to decide how much fish kids could eat, they said, what should we do about ethyl mercury? And said, well, as long as we're being cautious, let's take it out. All right. What about aluminum?
So aluminum's used as an adjuvant, which is an ingredient that helps boost the immune response to a vaccine, whether it's usually something that's going to be like a protein or inactivated vaccine. In large amounts, yes, certainly aluminum can cause toxicity, but those take quite large amounts, and usually it's going to be in people who can't eliminate it from their system naturally. So often dialysis patients, kidney failure patients. In industrialized society, I've got here actually an aluminum, sparkling water can sitting here in front of me. There is aluminum everywhere, and there are going to be small amounts of aluminum and aluminum salts that we're exposed to every day. The aluminum that's used in inactivated vaccines, generally speaking, is a tiny drop in the ocean of aluminum that most people are exposed to on a daily basis. And moreover, that being said, aluminum's not even in the MMR vaccine as an adjuvant. So the MMR vaccine doesn't even use it if that is a family's concern. But generally speaking, actually, they're probably getting more aluminum from the bottled water they're drinking than they are from the vaccines that they're receiving.
Or the can of soda. What about gelatin?
So gelatin's a protein made from animal tissue. It is often made from pork or pig. It's in a lot of food products. So Jell-O is probably one of the better known food products that uses gelatin. There's a risk of allergic reaction, very rare, about 1 in 2 million who can have an allergic reaction to gelatin, but it's a really rare allergy to have and generally not a concern for the vast majority of kids who could be getting it. And otherwise, it's not toxic. It's really just boiled animal protein from connective tissue.
And it's worth mentioning that there's been discussions by leading imams from both Sunni and Sufi sects, as well as leading rabbis, that the possibility that gelatin in the vaccines might have some pork protein in it is not a reason that observant people who keep kosher or who keep halal should avoid it. So you have religious dispensation from leading authorities.
Which leads us, I think, to another one that has been mentioned quite a bit recently, and that's the presence of fetal cell lines. I think I heard somebody saying that the MMR has debris from aborted fetuses in it. Can you address that?
Yes. So some vaccines, and it's really important to point out that not all vaccines, they are made using human fibroblast cells, which are descended from originally 2 electively terminated pregnancies back in the 1960s. So it would be really misleading to say that there's fetal debris in there, but you could say there are descendant cells that were used to create the vaccine. Not all vaccines, as I said, but the rubella component of the MMR does use those fibroblast cells to create that vaccine. It's understandable that maybe some families who have strong feelings about abortion, they might find that objectionable. And I do think that should be a validated concern. That being said, talking about religious dispensation from religious authorities, the Vatican's actually issued statements on this moral dilemma. I think it provides a little more ethical nuance. The Vatican says it's regrettable, and they would say the best road going forward would be to eliminate the use of any descendants cell lines from these original fetal cell lines so that people who are bothered by their conscience on receiving this don't have to be. However, the Vatican did clarify and say that the greater good is that we should use it to protect children if we have it and protect society at large through vaccination, even though it's using maybe a less ideal descendant cell line.
But remember, those cells were derived from fetuses that were electively aborted in the 1960s, not anything that has happened in the last 60 years.
And the cell lines are preserved. For local Utah listeners, the LDS Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has used the MMR vaccine widely around the world in its attempts to help relieve the world of measles. And the current president of the church, who is a physician, has referred to vaccines generally as being a gift from God, that we have the opportunity to help other people by getting rid of disease. How about the concerns about the MMR itself causing long-term side effects, autoimmune disease, infertility, chronic diseases?
The hypothesis that it could cause autoimmune disease, that goes all the way back to Wakefield again. That has not been shown in any observational or ecological studies. Likewise, infertility, chronic disease, those have not been demonstrated in any way associated with the MMR vaccine.
And let me end then with my favorite of all the arguments, and that's the vaccines are designed to make doctors and big pharma rich. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, so apparently, if that's happening, I completely missed that boat because I've never made a dime off of any vaccine or recommending a vaccine to any family. And if anything, going out of my way to try to discuss vaccination with families costs a great deal of time. So it would really be a net economic loss for me, but I know I'm doing the right thing. So
Right.
of course, I'm going to put all the time and effort I can into it because I know it's protecting children's lives. But if you want to dig in deeper, your doctor's never going to get rich from giving kids vaccines. It takes about 35 office visits, up to $2,500 to fully vaccinate a child all the way up until age 18. If we were a bunch of cold-hearted businessmen, we would say this is an awful return on investment because for most pediatric practices, vaccinating kids is one of their biggest expenditures in the office. Maintaining inventory, maintaining appropriate refrigeration, training staff. So actually, a lot of pediatric practices would improve their bottom line by just getting rid of vaccines entirely. Now, please don't do that if you're listening to this. We want you to vaccinate kids, but that's really just a very common sense argument to say nobody's getting rich from this. These are not blockbuster drugs like GLP-1 medications. These are really old technologies that help protect kids against serious diseases. And if anything, they don't constitute much of the bottom line for the revenue for big pharmaceutical companies. They're actually a very small share of those pharmaceutical companies' revenues. And really, it's the big blockbuster drugs that are the big money makers.
Yeah.
Merck could certainly stop making measles vaccine and it would impact their stock price not at all. But it's also worth mentioning that the inventors of the MMR vaccines, Marie Sellerman, John Enders, my old mentor, Sam Katz, never made a dime from their really earth-shattering invention.
And again, going back to what we talked about a little bit last week, vaccines have changed the course of the world and I think have put us in a very luxurious position now where families expect for their children to outlive them. And that's been a luxury of the last 100 years.
Yeah, prior to the modern era, honestly, the childhood mortality rate was about 50% for the vast majority of families in industrialized and non-industrialized societies. So really, half of all humans who ever lived died before age 15. We lose track of that. Immunizations are a big part of that success story. And I think that needs to be made clear to everybody, to the public, to trainees.
I think you could also argue that without vaccinations, the hospitalization rate for these children would increase, and actually, theoretically, it would increase the hospital's revenue from having all of these children in their hospital system.
I'm trying to work myself out of a job. I can't emphasize that.
Right. It occurs to all of us that the conversation about vaccines has shifted a little bit over the last several years. I think there is a little bit more mistrust. And I think one of the things that it behooves us to do is figure out how we have a rational and compassionate discussion about what's going on that has made people afraid.
When I've had conversations with families about vaccines, I think it's really important that when they have questions, you answer them with good science, good evidence. But at the same time, it does not help to harangue them with data and numbers or trying to scare them. There are actually some studies that show that that's almost fear-mongering to some people, and they'll actually react the other way. Sometimes they'll avoid conversations with you about vaccines if they see you as fear-mongering too much. I think the most important thing is just to be as completely authentic and be completely yourself as much as you possibly can. I tell the families, hey, I've come to know you really well. I really care about you. I care about your kids, and I want to support you all in every way I can. One of the most important ways I can help support and protect you and your kids is to recommend vaccination. And I always point out, I would never recommend anything that I don't do for my own kids. And when I've actually had success in getting a family to change their minds, vaccinate, it's never because I've been scaring them or throwing a whole bunch of data at them. Every single time it was because they recognized I was somebody who was in their corner, somebody who had come to know their family, and somebody they felt they could connect to and trust. And so I just really emphasize, I'm not the guy on the internet selling supplements. I'm not a boardroom executive making projections about profits. I'm a guy who's reading journal articles, riding the bus home, walking through my neighborhood, and giving my kids a hug at the end of the driveway. I'm a family just like their family, and
Right.
that's where I want to connect with them the most.
And occasionally I've heard colleagues say that they have either thought or said to their patients, if you're not going to listen to me on this, then what's the point of us having this relationship? And I think that misses the point, because I think if someone keeps coming back, they're listening, and it behooves us to play the long game with them.
I agree with that. I still maintain relationships with families who refuse to vaccinate, and actually even after my recommendations have still refused to vaccinate, yet they still keep coming back to me. So I look at every chance I talk to them as an opportunity to get to know them a little bit better, for them to get to know me a little bit better, and in every opportunity I get to hopefully try to get them to think about vaccines a little bit more.
They've changed the world. Do you want to comment just on the WHO Agenda 2030? Apparently, there's still some hope that we can make a difference in the world.
There's always a hope that we can make a difference in the world. There's always reason for hope. So we're aiming to save 50 million lives by providing access to life-saving vaccines by the end of 2030. Ultimately, measles is an eradicable disease. It is not carried by any other animal than human beings. And when an individual does have a measles infection, they are very symptomatic. These are criteria that we used to eliminate smallpox from the world. So measles is something that we can absolutely eradicate eventually. It may take time, it may take a lot of effort, but I think it's an extremely worthwhile goal. 50 million lives, that's from the WHO.
You just mentioned a number with a lot of zeros. 50 million lives? That's a lot of people. That's a lot of averted tragedies. Well, on that hopeful note, next week we'll talk about maybe some extraordinary things that we ought to be doing in the current climate. Thanks so much for your time. I know that there will be questions. For those of you who have questions, please send your questions to questions@vcurb.com, and we'll address those in a couple weeks. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Production design, thanks to Phil Wirkus, who also composed the theme music. See you next time. The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking.